Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Eternal Deck History series. In this series I talk about the history of a specific archetype in detail, in this case about Skycrag Yetis. The main basis for that will be my archive of Throne Tournament deck lists. I will try to fill in the gaps with what I can find on YouTube, Discord, Eternal Warcry and Reddit, but you have to keep in mind that I wasn't around for all of Eternal's history and that it can be tough to find detailed information on how a deck developed between tournaments. All deck history videos will follow the same general structure, which you can see here. Firstly, I will shortly talk about the defining features of the deck, the parts that stayed constant throughout all of the deck's history. After that, I will go through the history of the deck in chronological order, divided into core phases, 7 in the case of Skycrag Yetis. I will show example deck lists from those phases and talk about card choices and general developments, and all the reasons behind them. At the end, I include a modern version of the archetype, either from someone else when I can find one, or made by myself, and shortly talk about it. You can find all the deck lists, including that modern version, and all other important sources I used for each video, including a thanks to everyone who helped me with questions, in the description below. With all that said, let's dive into today's archetype, Skycrag Yetis. The core card in all phases of Skycrag Yetis was Wump Party Starter. He offered a board buff and additional damage at a cheap price, which, in addition to the generally aggressive stat lines and cheap cost of other Yetis, led to Skycrag Yetis being an aggro deck from the start. Later tribal payoffs like Footrock's Masterwork, which used to cost 3 power, and Maskmaker only reinforced those aggressive tendencies and pushed the power curve of the deck down even more. Even after the release of Wump as a promo in December of 2016, it took a few more months until we saw the first Skycrag Yeti experiments. My example list, which you can see on screen, of that early phase was posted by Main Ninja Please on Eternal Warcry in July 2017. It already had the low curve of all future Skycrag Yeti lists, but because of the low number of strong Yetis and because Wump was the only real tribal payoff at that point, it not only shared its slow curve, but also a lot of core cards with the simultaneously developing Skycrag aggro lists. But without any other Yeti synergies, the package wasn't strong enough compared to regular Skycrag aggro, so it had to wait for additional support to reach its first ETS tops. That support came with the release of Set 3, The Dusk Road, in late 2017. It included strong tribal payoffs like Iceberg War Chiefs and Sloped Sergeant, and a ton of new Yetis that were fairly efficient for their time, like Fearless Yeti or Footrock, which helped the deck achieve its first 2 ETS tops in the 2018 season. On the screen you can see the very first top, Bassoon Buffoon's ETS weekly winning list of May 2018. The deck still had the same aggro core as the preset free lists, but the inclusion of bigger Yetis like Footrock or Slope Sergeant meant that the curve went up, which also required more power, which is why this list was playing 28 power, and the second ETS topping list from set 4 even 30. But even with all the support from the Dusk Road, including the new helpful power cards like Common Cause and Granite Waystone, the deck remained a fringe meme option. That only changed when people started to trim down the top end to go back to a lower curve in set 5 Defiant. The release of Crunch the Hoarder in set 4 and Chunk in set 5 helped with that because they made the more expensive and also higher risk cards like Slope Sergeant unnecessary. And Chunk in particular meant that you could now play 29 power without actually having to play 29 power. Thanks to Pledge. All that led to the deck becoming a more prominent but still fringe part of the metagame, exemplified by 3 tops in the set 5 format of early 2019. The example list on screen is Talian's top 8 list from the ICQ Prize of Freedom in February 2019, but the other 2 topping Yeti lists of that format look pretty much the same with a few cards different here and there. They all played 8 1-drop in Snowgrass Yeti and Oni Ronin, the 8 strong 1-cost removal options Permafrost and Torch, 12 to 13 2-drops, always including Champion, Fearless Yeti and Dusk Raider, 16 to 18 3-drops, always including Crunch, Wump, Pock, who used to cost 3 power, and Howling Peak Smuggler, and lastly Chunk. The power base didn't get anything notable since set 3 outside of Chunk's Pledge, which did help with casting the 1-drop of your choice more consistently, but even with that additional help, 1-cost units like Yeti Spy and the newly released Mischief Yeti remained awkward because you couldn't rely on casting them turn 1, and Spy is specifically becomes a lot worse past turn 1. The release of set 6 shortly before the end of the 2019 tournament season did not help with that yet, but it included another card that would help push Yetis from a fringe deck to a top tier contender in 2020, Photrok's Masterwork, which used to cost 3 power until a nerf in August 2022. It offered a lot of things that Yetis desperately needed. The permanent buff effect finally offered redundancy to Wump, Snowball could kill smaller units or remove an Aegis, and both Jump Kick and Fend Off could enable attacks that previously weren't there. With another 3-cost board buff, cheap Yetis became more important, so the non-Yeti units got replaced almost completely, as I will show in the next chapter. But before I show an example list, I have to talk about the other important factor for the increasing success of Skycrag Yetis, which was the release of strong power cards between the 2019 and 2020 season. The first one was Skycrag Insignia, released both in the Trials of Krolov campaign in July 2019 and then later again in set 7 Flames of Xulta about 2 months later. The downside of Insignias did not affect the Yeti lists, and it helped with casting the 1-drops consistently, while also making double influence cards like the newly released Photrok's Masterwork achievable on curve. The other was the Emblem Cycle, released in set 7, which was especially good in aggressive decks like Skycrag Yetis, because decimating your power after you already reached 3 power wasn't that big of a cost in a deck that did not play a lot of cards, if any, that cost more than 3. They basically allowed you to only play 17 and 20 instead of 25 power, which reduced the risk of flooding by a lot, because the emblems were additional units that had the upside of still being power early on if necessary. With the powerful additions, Skycrag Yetis were able to get 5 tops in just 2 tournaments in set 7 format, including a top 4 from Arengee, whose list you can see on screen now. As I said before, the inclusion of Photrok's Masterwork led to the cut of non-Yeti units like Duskraider and Oni Ronin in favor of more cheap Yetis like Mischief Yeti and Yeti Spy, which became easier to play on turn 1 consistently thanks to Skycrag Insignia. The newly released Yeti Pioneer replaced Crunch the Hoarder to avoid overloading on 3-drops after the addition of Masterwork, and Pioneer could also help you to curve into those 3-drops if you were stuck on 2 power. Icebolt was another new addition, released in set 6, basically replacing the 2 and 3-cost flex spots of set 5 lists. The downside of the opponent getting to play a sigil of their choice wasn't very severe if you just killed your opponent on turn 4 or 5, and it was one of the few ways to deal efficiently with big endurance units like Sandstorm Titan. With the release of emblems, most of the topping players opted to cut sigils and seeds in favor of Skycrag banners, with this list as a notable exception. The rest of the power base was filled with insignias, diplomatic seals, and some single faction powers like Primal Waystone. As a short side note, Skycrag Yetis also was a pretty successful expedition deck in set 7, but this video is focused on Throne, so I will not go any deeper on that version. The release of set 8, Echoes of Eternity, brought another powerful addition that became a centerpiece of all future Yeti success, Blazing Salvo. It used to cost 1 power until a nerf in September 2021, so it was only slightly worse than Torch as removal, while also allowing you to enter the market and grab powerful cards like Icebolt or Torrential Downpour. Despite its strong addition, Yetis fell out of favor in set 8 and the early stages of set 9 because of the release of a powerful anti-aggro, especially tribal aggro, hate card in the Whispers of Throne campaign called Blight Moth. Moth used to cost 2 power between its release in late March 2020 and its nerf in early November of the same year, which was just too efficient for Yetis to beat most of the time. Because the opponent could just drop a Blight Moth on turn 2, kill your 1-drop, severely weaken or even kill your 2-drop, or they could drop it later and basically debuff your whole board while also getting a good unit on curve that leaves another shade behind. But despite that powerful anti-tribal hate, the deck still managed to get to at least get 5 tops in that period, including a top 4 for Always Face in the last Championship Qualifier right before the Blightmoth nerf. With the list you can see on screen now. The core of that list was similar to the set 7 versions, but the revert of Snowcross Yeti's nerf from 1-1 back to 2-1 stats meant that 12 or at least 10 1-cost Yetis became mandatory instead of just facultative, and Blazing Salvo replaced Icebolt, which was instead added to the market most of the time. The last change was to replace Chunk and or Howling Peak Smuggler with another free drop, usually either Milos, who still had Overwhelm at that point, or in this case Crunch. The trend to cut sigils down and seeds completely continued, and instead of Waystones, people now played the newly released Skycrag Yetis, who used to only need 2 of one influence to be undepleted and 2 of each influence to draw Treasure Trove. With the nerf to Blightmoth, we entered the most successful era of Skycrag Yetis, which includes 3 appearances at the 2020 World Championship, including a top 8, 4 tops in set 10 format in 2021 and 8 in set 11. The only really big change in the time period was the inclusion of Maskmaker after he got buffed from 4 to 3 cost in December 2020. He replaced the free drop flex spot, so either Milos or Crunch, but because those were usually only 2 offs, most lists also cut 1 copy of one of the 1 drops and 1 copy of one of the 1 cost removal options to make room for 4 Maskmakers, because the additional board white buff on turn 3 was just too good to pass up on. With that small change, we basically have the standardized list of set 10 and 11, with Quadrix top 8 from the ICQ Revelations as example on the screen. They all have 10 to 12 Yeti 1 drops. The only variation there was the choice to either play Powder Glider or Mischief Yeti as your third name. 11 to 12 1 cost removal spells, or cursors in the case of Permafrost. 12 Yeti 2 drops, and in set 11 also occasionally 2 copies of Armor Rug. 16 3 drops, and the Emblem plus Diplomatic Seal plus Banner and an Insignia power base. The rest of the power filled with Silixes before they got nerfed in early 2021, and after that usually a few more sigils, but some people still kept playing Silixes even after the nerf. The markets were a bit more flexible, but there were still clear trends. Most of them included Seer as a way to kill smaller units or to close games out, either Backlash or Dazzle to negate board wipes and similarly problematic spells, and Iceball to kill bigger units. The last 2 spots were either filled with relic removal like Slag, additional unit removal like Edict of Shafka or Edict of Linrai, proactive cards like D'Angelo Houndmaster or Inspired Prank, which you could easily bargain in, or a small board wipe like Torrential Downpour. While the deck was still successful from late 2020 to late 2021, it was never really dominating the format, but despite that it had to eat one nerf after another, some directly aimed at it, some more incidental. The first big wave came in September 2021 with some incidental nerfs. Blazing Salvo's cost was up to 2, Amarok's buff was changed from 2 to 1 attack, and Houndmaster's Hounds were changed from 4 4s to 4 1s. While Blazing Salvo's nerf hurt the deck a lot, Amarok was only occasionally played and Houndmaster was still a good market card, so those nerfs weren't too bad. The first direct nerf hurt a lot more. In December 2021, Pok was changed from 3 to 4 cost. He was a crucial part of the game plan before because he could consistently allow you to end up with 3 Yetis on turn 2 by bonding him in with one of the 12 free attack Yeti 2 drops on turn 2 or one of the 8 2 attack Yeti 1 drops, which made the 3 cost board buffs way better, because if you have 3 Yetis on board, of course you're getting more stats from the board buff. That nerf was already enough to basically kill any competitive viability of Skycrag Yetis, especially in addition to the salvo change, but Direwolf still decided to hit the deck even harder by upping the cost of Masterwork to 4 in August 2022. With all those nerfs and the later nerf to reduce Champion of Fury's attack to 1, the aggro version of Yeti seems very questionable right now. I still tried my best to make it work, as you can see on screen. I kept the basic principles of the set 9 to set 11 Yetis, which means 10 1-drops. I decided to play Powder Glider instead of Mischief, but either is fine. 12 Yeti 2-drops with Blank replacing Fearless Yeti. I was close to cut Champion of Fury instead, because he's pretty bad after his latest nerf, but I still think the charge is worth a bit more than the effect of Fearless. Then the 16 free drops, but with Masterwork at 4 power now, so 12 free drops and 1 4-drop. And Common Structure instead of the nerf Pok. And lastly, 10 1-cost removal spells with Volatile Reaction replacing Blazing Salvo. That means that this deck doesn't really have market access. Instead, I'm playing 2 bargain cards that you can easily get to. Invasive Species, which You just have to hit with any power while your hand is empty, and Inspired Brain, which is easy to hit because you're playing a bunch of Yetis. The power base is also mostly the same. I just cut the few remaining sigils, except for one primal sigil, just in case you get hit with an Ice Bolt, and one primal emblem, and replace them with some primal marks, because they are basically primal sigils, at least, but if you really need the fire, you can deplete them for one fire influence. And Exalting Conclave to have better influence fixing. They are basically additional copies of Diplomatic Seal. They are a bit worse early on, but they can still give you influence fixing later on. So they have some upsides, some downsides compared to Diplomatic Seal. While this list can still take games, especially against greedy decks that aren't well prepared against aggro, it barely got any new additions since 2021, while other aggro decks got a ton of new tools. So I wouldn't recommend it unless you specifically want to play tribal aggro, and even then Rakano only seems like the better option. I made a second, completely different version of the Skycrag Yetis. This version tries to make use of some new cards and buffs that Yetis got since 2021. And instead of really aggressive version, it's more like a mid-range version. The centerpiece of this deck is Xultan Ambassador. To fully use his ability, I included 20 efficient Yeti heroes, most of which are multi-factioned, which is why I also included Mother of Skies, who helps with surviving the early game, while still remaining important in the late game, because she just can just give you a bunch of flyers. Mother of Skies also works well with Kenna, who is easy to cast in this list because the power base is already skewing primal for cards like Wump. Then the rest are some spells, including damage-based removal, which works well with Torque because he buffs the damage, and Nom Nom because he basically also buffs the damage. And then card draw and some market access for more removal or proactive cards like Masterwork, which I don't think is good enough to play in the main deck here because this is more of a mid-range version and Masterwork is just not that efficient anymore, but it can be a good cut out of the market. I wouldn't call this version top tier either, mostly because it's just too fair compared to other good decks on Throne, but it is good enough to climb the ladder and very enjoyable to play thanks to its myriad of different explicit and implicit synergies. Just as a reminder, you can find all deck lists in the description below. This marks the end of the second episode of the Eternal Deck History series. If you haven't already, you can check out the first Deck History episode and all Eternal Top 10 episodes, including an introductory video on my channel. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a nice week.